With that, I will kick us off and we can get rolling. Folks, welcome to our session, Enforce the Law, Motor Voter Act in the disabilities community. I am Pat Clark. I am the board chair of Keystone Progress Education Fund, a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. I'm also right now serving as acting executive director of both Keystone Progress Education Fund and the organization that produces this event, Keystone Progress, which is an independent 501c4 advocacy organization. So thanks a million. This is our 13th edition of the Keystone Progress Summit, Pennsylvania's Progressive Summit. And on behalf of Keystone Progress, I would like to thank you all for participating, especially our panelists. I'd also like to thank our event sponsors at the ACLU of Pennsylvania, and I'm very grateful for their support, and for each and every one of you who are in attendance today. And I want to start by introducing our panelists and our expert panelists. Pennsylvania representative, House of Representatives member from just north of where I live here in the east end of Pittsburgh, Representative Jesse Benham. Thanks so much for joining us. Scott Seaborg from All Voting is Local, who is joining us from out east there in Philadelphia. And Paul O'Hanlon, Esquire, as I will denote, who is joining us and is actually, I will say, one of the instigators of this, and has been a lead on making sure that the NVRA is enforced for a number of years. This is an issue that's going to be at the core of our organization's work in supporting those community-based organizations that want to make sure that those people whom they serve in the disabilities community are active in making sure that all of their peers and neighbors in the community are aware that they should register and also encouraged to vote. So I'm very excited to kick this off. Paul O'Hanlon, I will take your instructions on how to proceed with next steps on the shared screen here on your presentation. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, well, thanks, Pat. Welcome, everybody. I'm here to talk generally and specifically about the National Voter Registration Act, and really to raise a number of concerns, alarms, possibilities. Next slide. That's you, Pat. So what is the NVRA? The National Voter Registration Act of 1993. It's commonly known as the Motor Voter Law. Each state's Bureau of Motor Vehicles is required to serve as a voter registration agency. Emphasize those words, voter registration agency, and to regularly provide each person that interacts with PennDOT with an opportunity to register to vote. Next slide. But the NVRA also requires each state to designate as voter registration agencies all offices that provide public assistance, and Congress meant this to be the broad category of public assistance, not just cash assistance, and also all offices that provide state-funded programs that primarily serve people with disabilities. Next slide. Why these other agencies? So Congress was aware that individuals living in poverty and individuals living with disabilities are significantly less likely to own and drive a car. And so these other agencies were included in the NVRA to ensure that voters on the margins of society were provided with opportunities to register to vote. Next slide. So what does it require? NVRA requires ongoing, regular offers to register to vote at a minimum when a person applies for services or benefits. Number two, when they recertify eligibility or report a change of address. And the NVRA requires a specific question to be asked. So if you're in an NVRA agency and they ask a question like, do you want to register to vote, or are you registered to vote? The truth is that's the wrong question. It is a specific question that the NVRA requires to be asked, which is, are you registered to vote at your current address? And if not, would you like to register to vote here today? And the reason is because that opening kind of phrase, are you registered to vote at your current address, is critical because a lot of people don't realize that when they move, they have to re-register. And so I don't know if Pat's still here. Can we go to the next slide? Yes. So the compliance with the NVRA has been a huge problem. According to the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration, they've declared that the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 is the most often ignored federal voting rights law. Next slide. But why should you care? Next slide. So I want to sort of start off by kind of saying that the NVRA requires a nonpartisan process, with the, strictly nonpartisan. And so in this presentation, what I'm hoping to demonstrate is the need for an effective nonpartisan voter registration program in Pennsylvania. But I want to have this conversation within kind of partisan realities that we're dealing with. Next slide. So the truth is that when you look at voter registrations over the last 5 years in Pennsylvania, you see something that is very concerning to people like me, which is that from 2016 through 2020, 357,000 Pennsylvanians registered to vote who were previously unregistered. So we gained 358,000, but of that, only 10,500 were registered Democrat. A whopping 250,000 were registered Republicans, and no affiliation or other was basically 10 times the number of registrations that Democrats had since 2016. So I think this is a very alarming trend. Next slide. So I want to kind of say that all of the data in this presentation is taken from the Department of State's yearly reports to the Pennsylvania legislature that is made on an annual basis. And one of the reasons why this report is made annually is in compliance with the requirements of the NVRA, because in this report, the state sort of spells out what steps it's taken to comply with the NVRA. Next slide. So let's start with looking at the reality of how people register to vote today. And so here we see that voter register. So let's start kind of to the right side. VR, voter registration drives. Voter registration drives, the last reported year, basically numbered about 53,000, which was a small number compared to, say, PennDOT registrations, which were 190,000, and mail registrations, which were about 250,000. And but let's go to the next slide, because what's important is to look at how those registrations compared with the new registrations. In other words, what you see, for example, if we go to the right side of the screen, PennDOT change of address transfers were overwhelming. I mean, the largest number of registrations were change of addresses through PennDOT, but what you see was very few of those were actually new registrations. When you're looking at the new registrations, again, looking at the voter registration drives, you see that the number is actually a whole lot smaller than 53. And so if we Democrats are behind at the rate of 250,000, it's going to take us a number of years through those voter registration drives to actually change those numbers. Next slide. So let's talk briefly about what are these agencies covered by the National Voter Registration Act. So Pennsylvania agencies, WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, disability agencies, county mental health, intellectual disability services, county assistance offices. That's where people would apply for cash assistance, food stamps, medical assistance. Clerk of Orphans Court, that's where you apply for marriage licenses. So in Pennsylvania, when you apply for a marriage license, you get an opportunity to register to vote, or should. Children and youth offices, healthcare facilities, state-supported higher education, and schools and paratransit agencies are all covered by the NVRA. Next slide. What I want to kind of talk briefly about is what I would identify as 3 failures in the system. Number one, there's a consistent failure to systemically include all offices and programs that provide assistance or services to the disabled. And I'll talk briefly about what I mean by failure to include. Secondly, is a failure of what I would describe as the county-based service system. So we've got a very complicated service system in the United States and in Pennsylvania. And what's complicated about it is where you apply for benefits or where you apply to be admitted to a particular program depends on the program. And so, for example, if you're getting services through your county-based mental health, intellectual disability system, you don't apply at the county assistance office. You don't apply at a state office. You go to a county-based program, and that what I'm going to show you is that the county-based programs are largely unattached and disconnected from the NVRA process. And then third is failure to provide, I can't see the bottom of my slides, unfortunately, in the screen. What's 3 say? Failure to provide the same level of
service in completing the voter registration forms as is provided in completing agency forms.
Completing agency forms. Sorry about that.
So one of the requirements is the NVRA is that the agency has to provide the same level of service in completing the form as they provide in completing their own forms. So, they can't essentially give a lesser level of service for the voter registration aspect of the encounter. Next slide. So, so when I hear the phrase programs primarily engaged in providing services to persons with disabilities, I'm shocked to discover that that doesn't include nursing homes. I'm here to tell you, you don't get into a nursing home unless you have a diagnosis that qualifies you as being disabled at that point in time. So everyone in a nursing home is a person with a disability at that point in time. What about personal care homes? Personal care homes aren't covered. What about drug and alcohol residential facilities? They're not covered. Well, why not? So what you see is that when you do a kind of a inventory of, well, what's covered, what programs are covered, and where would you So, for example, where would you have to provide the opportunity to register to vote to people in nursing homes? Can you claim that you're going to provide that at a county assistance office to people who are perhaps bedbound? It seems that unless this is being done in a nursing home, it's not being done. And the fact is that they're not being done in nursing homes, and nursing homes aren't monitored for compliance with the NVRA. Next slide. So factoid, what's Pennsylvania's third largest city? So if I looked up Google says it's Allentown with 120,000 residents. But in reality, it's Pennsylvania's long-term care facilities. So when you add up the 75,000 nursing home residents and the 55,000 personal care home residents, you see that we've got actually 130,000 people living in our long-term care facilities, which outnumber Allentown. And Allentown, I'm here to tell you, includes a lot of kids and minors who aren't eligible to vote yet. And almost none of our long-term care facilities have children or people under the legal age to vote. And so what I want to tell you is that we've got a political system that dedicates almost no resources, no political campaign, in my experience, has really tried to reach out to Pennsylvania's long-term care residents. And what we kind of consistently see is that the third largest city in the state is systematically ignored in our political process. Next slide. So I want to kind of give a little bit of a background to my advocacy and kind of show what has happened in Pennsylvania over the last 20 years, 15 years. So around 2006, I started working in the area of nonpartisan civic engagement with people like Pat Clark, and we were surprised to discover that there was this system of monitoring NVRA compliance. And when we discovered this system, we were surprised to discover that Allegheny County had registered 0 people in every category in 2006. So the 2007 was when we sort of discovered this process, and that was gearing up for the big 2008 presidential election. What you'll see here is beginning in 2008, our numbers started to go up. So you can only go up from 0, but we were I guess that what I would say is the area that we primarily were working in was disability agencies, and which included things like, to some extent, healthcare, to some extent, special education, to some extent, paratransit, but largely under disability agencies. And but what we were aware of is, as our numbers went up, that they were all really toy numbers. None of the numbers reflected the scale of people who were being served. Next slide. And so in 2012, after kind of making tiny incremental progress, a lawsuit was filed, Black Political Empowerment Project versus ACL, and essentially alleging that there was a systemic failure to comply with the NVRA in the Commonwealth. But the lawsuit specifically focused on county assistance offices. Next slide. And so what happened was, after that lawsuit, county assistance office registrations exploded. The before and after was just striking. Before, we never really kind of broke 5,000, and immediately the year of the lawsuit, which was filed very late in the year, registrations doubled that year and continued to go up by, almost a factor of 10 and higher for years. So the before and after of that lawsuit was very, very striking. But next slide. But what you'll see though is, again, I'm kind of jumping between state numbers and local numbers, just because the local numbers, I think, are reflective of the state as well. What you see is that locally, the county assistance office numbers went up proportional to the state numbers. But what you see is that all of the other numbers, the disability agencies, the children and youth, the area agency on aging, all of the other numbers have remained essentially toy, pretend, just placeholder numbers that I think don't reflect in any way the number of people that are being served. Next slide. So I want to kind of just give you a sense of, so Allegheny County's Department of Human Services serves about 200,000 people per year. And it does that through contracts with 405 agencies. And so what is created is this huge umbrella of agencies that have contracts to provide county funded services, but none of those contracts actually specifically pass on voter registration obligations. And, in my experience, every time I talk to a county funded agency and ask them specific questions about NVRA compliance, mostly what I get is bullshit information. Stuff like, well, we have voter registration forms in the waiting room, or they say stuff that indicates that they're really not performing the duties that are required under the NVRA. Next slide. The part that I think makes this very difficult is that Allegheny County DHS has a no wrong door policy. And so what that means is that any of these 405 agencies that are funded under these 5 broad program offices, you as an individual could go to any of these agencies and apply for services. And if that's essentially the wrong agency, they'll forward you, to refer you to the proper agency, but the intake will have been done. And the offer to register to vote would have not been provided because they're not doing it. And part of the problem is that I think the state, when I talk to the state, they have a very kind of Stalinist bureaucratic model where they think that everybody applying for services goes through some office somewhere, that it's either like a county assistance office, or if it's at the county level, that there's some office in Allegheny County's Department of Human Services where somebody sits and applies for services. And they seem to think that one location, if they can identify it, that's where they're going to get everything done. And the problem is that's not how the world works anymore. So next slide. So how do we address this? So what the BPEP versus ACL lawsuit did was it created a very kind of process-oriented correction, and things like appointments of site coordinators at each agency. But in my experience, getting nonprofit agencies to provide services required by the NVRA is really extremely difficult. I've had explicit conversations with CEOs about what's required and why they're not doing it, and essentially been told that unless the state's willing to pay them, they see this as being excess work that they're not being paid to do, and that if they're not penalized for not doing it, essentially, I've been told they're just not likely to do it. Next slide. Could we do something different? So 1993, I'll point out, was before the internet, before the wave of contracting out of social services. It also predates all of the various sort of list matching and voter engagement technologies that have come to existence since 1993. And what's apparent to me is that Allegheny County DHS and Allegheny County's Department of Elections could automate and really kind of make this process of identifying who's not registered, who needs an opportunity to register to be provided to them, could be automated and made a whole lot simpler than this sort of blanket kind of requirement of the NVRA that requires all of these 405 agencies to have site, coordinators and do all this stuff. Next slide. So essentially, I see that there are two kind of conflicting directions that we could, or approaches that we could use, but fundamentally, I'm concerned that I think people don't understand how the fact that we're squandering the NVRA and the requirements of the NVRA is leaving a large segment of really what I would identify as the Democratic base unregistered. Next slide. So I want to kind of give a sense of where I think the breakdown occurs. So what the report gives us is the summary of voter registrations offered. And these numbers are from voter preference forms that the Department of State collects from these NVRA agencies. And so just to kind of go through the number, what I want to point out is that if you look at the WIC totals, that pretty closely matches the state's number of WIC participants, like 200,000. But when you look at the disability agencies, 16,000, I just want to point out that when I calculated how many people are in state-funded disability programs, starting with the 130,000 in our nursing homes and personal care homes, I came up with over 1 million. And yet it appears that 16,000 of that million got an opportunity, or actually 40,000, 16 plus 24,000 under the county MHID. The whopping number is, of course, under the county assistance offices, and you'll see that almost 3 million voter preference forms were generated by the county assistance office. Let's go to the next slide. But here's what's interesting. So on the top is, of course, the voter registrations offered. On the bottom is the number of declines. In other words, if the agency offered you an opportunity to register to vote and you declined and you filled out the voter preference form saying, I declined to register to vote, they calculate it. And so looking under that county assistance office number, what you'll see is that of the 2,800,000 that were offered, only 700,000 declined, which leaves a large number of people who didn't decline that offer to register to vote. Next slide. So what I did was I calculated, so of those offers, we had, of 3 million offers, we had 1 million people decline, which left about 2 million 220,000 people who were offered the opportunity to register to vote who didn't decline, but of that 2 million, only 40,000 registered to vote. So the question is, where are the other 2,200,000 missing voters in our system that we can't actually show that they declined an offer to vote, register to vote, but they didn't actually register to vote? Why I'm concerned about this is that if you go through the process of applying for cash assistance online, what you'll discover is that the way that you're offered an opportunity to register to vote is at some point in that online process, you're dumped into the Department of State's website, where you can find your way on that website to register online if you're in their system. If, for example, you have a driver's license and they have a ID and a signature on file, you can register online. If you don't have those things, then you have to print out a form and mail it in, which doesn't actually comply with the requirements of the NVRA, because that's not what happens when you have to complete the agency's forms. So I guess the bottom line is that what I see is that the state's official documents demonstrate, I think, that they're not complying with the NVRA, that there are potentially millions of people in the system who have some level of a request to register to vote, who haven't declined but clearly haven't been registered to vote, and it's got, I think, significant consequences for our political process. Next slide. So essentially, that's my spiel. I'm very concerned about this kind of situation in Pennsylvania. I think that it actually makes a big difference for who our electorate is and what our politics are. So with that, I'll stop blabbing.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for blabbing. Very informative blab. I'm going to then tag team on Representative Benham, knowing what's up with our state government, and then also Scott. Scott and I have talked previously about this, about drilling down to that county level as we did here in Allegheny County. So Representative Benham, what the hell?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say that about a lot of things in state government or in government more broadly, this being just one of them. And I do apologize. I have been talking a lot lately, so I am starting to lose my voice. I do have tea, so hopefully it lasts me out for a little bit here. But yes, I mean, all that to say, we need a meaningful investment into our election system on the state level. And that's everything from ensuring that people are being reached to get registered to vote, to making sure that our counties have the resources necessary to actually run elections. So we have a lot of work to do on the state level. It's work I'm proud to be part of with my House Democratic colleagues and the Senate Democrats on the other side of the building also doing their part. But with a Republican-controlled General Assembly, it feels like every omnibus voting rights bill that comes to the floor contains poison pills, right? Maybe it gives more money to the counties, but at the same time, it also completely eliminates the ability to have ballot drop boxes, right? Maybe it gives more money to the counties in order to keep polling places open and keep poll workers. Maybe it allows the counties to start canvassing ballots earlier, while at the same time decreasing the ability to have mail-in voting or perhaps eliminating it at all. And so what our fight has been on the state level is, oftentimes we're voting against legislation that may do some really good things, may be very helpful to counties and county agencies, may at some points make voting or voter registration more accessible, but at the same time completely undermines the foundation of the voting system to begin with. So hopefully one of these days we'll be in a place where we can bring true voting rights legislation to a vote in our General Assembly. I'll hope to continue to be part of that fight. But right now it seems like what I'm doing is pressing no a lot of the time to try to stop the worst from happening to our democracy here in this state. And there's a lot of implications when it comes to voting for people with disabilities, for our older adults, just in terms of who we see representing us in state government and national government, at every level of government, really. When we make it more difficult for vulnerable and marginalized populations, everything from, working parents to older adults to people with disabilities to actually be able to participate in democracy, that has an impact on who actually has the privilege to take that time to participate. And we see that reflected then in the process in Harrisburg and nationally as well, in terms of whose interests, namely those privileged enough to have the spare time or resources to participate. It's their interests that get represented. It's the interests of those who can afford to donate to elected officials. It's really frustrating. So, to echo what Pat said, what the.
I chose to keep that mild. Paul and Jessica, one of the things I never want to have a conversation about a community without having representatives from the community. Both of you are very active and certainly doing great stuff within the disabilities community. One of the things that I've talked about with Paul previously is mobilizing those folks within the community who are active, who vote every time, to be leaders within the community, to make sure that those who are not informed do register and vote, just peer to peer. But beyond that, dogging the hell out of the elected officials at a county, municipal, and state level. Is that something that you think will be effective to be able to mobilize some level of change around this?
It's interesting, right? I think anytime we expect a marginalized community to solve problems that have been created by the privileged few, we're setting them up for failure, right? So maybe leaders with disabilities can help encourage additional people from the disability community to register and to get involved. But if the overall system and structure is set up to disadvantage and discourage participation, we can't expect marginalized communities to be able to solve that. Disabled people didn't create that problem, right? Those barriers to access were not created by our community. And so any steps that we take are Band-Aids. We need structural, systemic change. And as to whether or not advocating, lobbying, bird dogging elected officials is effective, I think it depends. I think it depends on the elected official and who their stakeholders are. When we have so many people in Harrisburg who take corporate PAC contributions, who are not actually accountable to regular people, they brush off those interactions as a mild annoyance that's maybe a slight disruption to their day and then move on. I think about the ways in which, for example, March on Harrisburg has been really following around a lot of elected officials who have been, standing in the way of meaningful democracy reforms. And yet we don't see anything change. So, I think it's a tough one. And that goes back to expecting a marginalized community to solve the barriers put in their way that they didn't create. But I also think the more that we draw attention to the ways in which Harrisburg and the ways in which our national governments are not working for vulnerable, marginalized, everyday working class people, the better shot we have at putting people in office who will actually listen and make the changes that we need to see.
There, I broke my New Year's resolution again, to remember to unmute. Scott, your organization has been doing, as they say, a yeoman's level of work at county level in parts of the state. How do you see this mobilizing around this issue at a local level? And what can your organization do to support that?
So All Voting is Local has been doing county-based coalition convenings in coalitions across, in counties across the state. And, I have a background in working to pass automatic voter registration laws. I used to work for a shop called CSME, the Center for Secure and Modern Elections. And my job was to assess what states were ripe to pass automatic voter registration laws, and sort of codifying this NVRA process into a state law, whereby when you go to the DMV, they have to offer you registration. Ideally, if they have all of the citizenship information that is showing them that you are eligible to vote, that would be something that would just be tacked on to the experience and say, through this experience today, you are going to be registered to vote. If you would like to decline, take these 3 steps. And sort of, one important thing as an aside is to make sure that you're doing a opt-out instead of an opt-in with these systems. And part of my job at CSME was working with election officials to implement these systems, right? Like, we all know that the DMV and the Department of State and the Department of Health and Human Services in any state don't really want to talk to each other. That's a big problem, I think, systemically. And the other piece is that talking with election officials, I think some folks, don't realize that that's a really hard job. The only time that election officials get any, airtime or press is when something messes up, and then everybody's really mad at them, right? And so one thing that we've learned is that there is a vernacular, there's a language that we can use to talk with election directors, and the important part of that language is that we're utilizing former election directors and staff, right? And so when we center Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations and their adjacent allies at a table to talk about how we're going to improve these systems, we need to sort of hold 2 things, right? One, we need to be able to support our election officials in their jobs. Right now, they're getting death threats. Right now, there are calls in counties, for example, in Luzerne County, where individuals on the county council, even though the election director is paid the least amount of money in the entire state, they would like to cut that budget. Well, why would they like to do that? Oh, they want people to vote in a different way than they did in 2020, right? And so we need to be able to stand up for election directors or sit down and support them if you're a person with a disability like I am. And at the same time, not all election directors are meeting voters where they are, right? And so we need to be able to also hold them accountable. And we need to be able to do those 2 things at once. It's sort of a dialectic, right? So how do we support them? We help with poll worker recruitment. We help with bilingual poll worker recruitment. In Allegheny County, when there is a mess up from our favorite vote by mail ballot vendor over in Ohio, we'll organize our local coalition and table to make a couple you know, 5,000 or 6,000 phone calls to make sure that the voters that received those incorrect ballots know what happened, understand what the process is to, you know, have their vote counted duly, and are able to then do that. And then at the same time in Allegheny County, I have to take a moment and absolutely shame the county commissioner, Rich Fitzgerald. There is 1.2 million people in Allegheny County. There is one drop box. That is absolutely shameful. And we need to create a long-term dynamic where it is absolutely unacceptable for someone who wants to run for the county commissioner to hold these views that the freedom to vote doesn't need to be expanded, that we don't need to meet voters where they are, particularly with voters with disability, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods, right? So there is a name and shame, but at the same time, we need to be able to help them. And what I would say to, you know, our lawmakers going to pay attention, power concedes nothing without a demand. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and my first campaign was knocking on doors around the old Sunoco refinery in South and Southwest Philadelphia. Some plucky canvassers and a couple op-eds made an oil company spend $70 million to clean up their act because they were afraid of the bad press. It's possible for us to make these changes, particularly the structural changes that we need, and we need long-term programming and long-term resources dedicated to this stuff, because the other side, never going to stop.
I guess I want to kind of chime in here. I think that one of the disturbing lessons that I took away from the process of working with the state over a long period of time regarding the NVRA is that there wasn't an appreciable difference between the Democratic and Republican administrations. That in both cases, I didn't get a sense that anybody wanted to hear from these people. You know, that I didn't honestly get a sense that the Rendell administration was more anxious to register public assistance recipients than the Republican governor was. And so I wonder whether it's a factor of the executive, you know, whether it's the executive of Allegheny County, who's really not interested in hearing from the people who are getting services from Allegheny County DHS, or the governor. But I guess that what I see is that if none of the contracts pass on the voter registration obligation, then it's a matter of the executive not doing that. It doesn't require legislation. If it's a matter of that.
I think it's important to remember, though, that the Allegheny County executive has comparatively more power. I mean, not really, but like in relation to the legislative body. So Allegheny County Council is a very weak legislative body. The General Assembly is a very strong legislative body.
Right.
So the governor has to negotiate much more strongly, particularly if we're going to talk about funding or if we're going to talk about regulatory change. You know, the particular ways in which we do things as a state government disadvantage the executive by virtue of the relationship and negotiations that have to happen with the legislature, particularly if we're going to talk about things that would require appropriation. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Whereas, you know, the Allegheny County executive is constrained in other ways, just so we're clear. But with regard to the relationship with county council, it's, you know, it's very different. It's a very weak legislative body as opposed to the General Assembly, which is much stronger. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
I think one thing that I would sort of piggyback on there is that, you know, an example from Allegheny County in 2020, Commissioner Fitzgerald was at the same place. Even with the brand new Act 77, there was no interest in doing satellite election offices, which essentially serve as early voting sites, or doing drop boxes. And so after a pressure campaign with a bunch of stakeholders and groups and individuals in the county, Commissioner Fitzgerald relented, wove his wand, and then we had early voting sites. So people at the county level absolutely have the purview, the power, and the ability to set these things in motion. I think that, you know, financial considerations are always something that's a huge deal. But I would stress that even though the regulatory powers to change systemic things are definitely held by the state and not the secretary, unfortunately, the county level executives and election directors have an enormous amount of latitude to meet voters where they are. And a lot of them choose to not do that, and that's unacceptable.
So yeah, Pat had to jump to another panel, so I'm subbing in here. Hello, everybody. I'm Jenna. I'm the secretary of the Keystone Progress Education Fund, for those of you who do not know me. So it looks like we are kind of coming up on time here, but I know we might be a little bit behind. Let me look at the agenda here. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you are listening, you can either put it in the chat or you can request to share your audio and video. No? No questions. I guess you guys have explained everything so well that this has been a very interesting conversation. You know, I think disability rights is something that's so often overlooked by able-bodied people who just don't, you know, they don't ever have to think about what it's actually like to move around in a world that's not, you know, not designed for you, kind of, right? Like, so this has been a very, very interesting conversation. If we're not seeing any questions here from the audience, I mean, do any of you have anything else you want to add to close this off?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about some hopeful stuff, right? There's a lot of challenges. They're coming after our elections with the long knives. They want to destroy democracy. It's really, really wild. And so we're here to fight on the long term. And, you know, let me paint a picture for you. You know, we've got this automatic voter registration idea, which is basically folding voter registration into existing systems and processes and not making it an extra thing that people have to do as a course of completing those processes. And so automatic voter registration has typically, and NVRA has typically been satisfied at the Department of Motor Vehicles, right? People need IDs, they got to be able to drive cars, but a lot of people don't need IDs and can't drive cars and don't have the resources to drive cars. And so what's the next logical step in expanding the structural way that we do voter registration? Well, it's going to be going to all of the benefit offices that Paul, you know, so nicely laid out for us. And, you know, I believe that we need to move towards a system that automatically registers any individual that receives a Medicaid application in that household that is eligible to vote through the process of filling out Medicaid forms. And in Oregon, when you go to the DMV, you're automatically registered and they're going to send you a postcard. And it says, hey, you've been registered to vote because you went to the DMV. If you would like to not be registered, check this box and send this back to us. Guess what most people do? They stay registered, right? And so this is a process by which, you know, Medicaid is not going to give money to you if you are not a citizen, for the most part. And I know that there are certain programs that do that, but one thing that Medicaid is very, very particular about is establishing citizenship information, because they don't want to break the law, I think, by spending money from federal coffers that they shouldn't be. And I think there's some severe like penalties out there for that. And so we've got, as you know, as a community and a state and a federal government, all the information we need to identify who's eligible to vote that is applying for Medicaid and who also lives at that house. If Pennsylvania registered DHS applicants at the same rate as the DMV, it would add nearly 1 million voter registrations. And that's the goal. And so I think we need to move towards that place and understand that there is no process we can't improve, because we pay for this thing. It's our government, right? And Representative Benham goes and fights for us as a matter of course in doing that. And so, you know, believe that this can happen. Hi, Kitty. And, you know, hold out hope while also acknowledging that we're in a pretty bad place right now and we need some massive improvements.
Yeah, I totally agree with automatic registration. But I think the one thing I just want to bookmark is that we do a terrible job of capitalizing on our victories. So the National Voter Registration Act was a tremendous victory that we're squandering by not enforcing it. And I just want to kind of like highlight the changes that were made when the state was sued were so dramatic in the county assistance office numbers that I would just assert that if similar actions were done by the other agencies, we would have similar explosions in registrations, and that this isn't something that requires legislation. It requires follow through because the law is already there. It's already required. We're simply not doing it. I mean, when we've got contracts with agencies to provide state-funded services, and those contracts don't pass on the voter registration duties, states have been sued over that by the DOJ and lost. So why don't we wake up to the fact that this is something that we should be doing? I'm just sort of scandalized that we're allowing this law to essentially be ignored.
I think we certainly should be doing it. I don't know that it is as simple as sticking it into these contracts. You know, typically a lot of that is structured by regulatory forces, you know, and the particulars of contract negotiations at the state level.
But there's a federal law that requires it. There's a federal law.
So it should be reflected in regulation at the state level. But regulation has to typically be reviewed by the General Assembly. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. We should. I'm saying that the reason likely why administrations have struggled to do that is not necessarily because they don't think it's important, but because it is complicated to actually make that happen when there are forces at work that don't want to see it happen. So it's not as simple as a governor or a secretary snapping their fingers and saying, hey, let's put this into a contract. It's not how it works. Do we need political will? Yes, we need political will, but we also need an acknowledgement of the forces that we are fighting back against at the state level that complicate this.
Well, somehow when they're sued, they magically find the ability to do it.
Yes, so lawsuits tend to have that impact. One of the only ways in which our state legislature actually gets anything done. Perhaps we'll see some education funding as a result of the latest batch of lawsuits. One can only hope. I wish it was not that way.
Yeah.
I wish it was not.
Absolutely. I think if there's anything I've learned from working in Harrisburg, it's that you got to hit them from every single angle to get to move an inch. You know, you have to hit them from so many different angles just to move things. This has been really great. Thank you all for joining us in this wonderful discussion here today. All of the sessions are going to be available under the replay option, and then we'll also have video that, you know, so if you want to share this out to folks later, they'll still be able to watch it. Thank you for joining. I think we are out of time for this session. Hopefully y'all will stick around and catch some of our other great sessions that are happening.
Cool. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Pleasure. Bye-bye.